Representation in this standard mode is thought of as a principal-agent relationship, where the constituent, as a principal, authorizes, for example through an election, the representative, as an agent, to then produce a policy output. This policy output then gets re-evaluated by the principal. If it is deemed negative, the representative won't be re-elected, and if it is deemed positive, well, then this representative will be re-elected.
We are starting with our next speaker, and our next speaker is Melvin Geib Caballero, a research associate in political science at the University of Kaiserslautern and Landau, whose work focuses on how animals gain political representation in more inclusive democracies. He combines ethical and political theory to explore practical ways forward for animals in society. His presentation today will discuss possible reforms for animal representation and argue for a realistic step that can bring meaningful change soon. So please welcome with me Melvin Geib Caballero.
Yeah, hello. Thanks for being here. So, as was just stated, I will use the next roundabout 30 minutes to present what I think should be the next step concerning the political representation of animals. For that, I will, based on their right to democratic representation, evaluate different institutional reforms for the political representation of animals that have been proposed by political scientists, political theorists, and animal rights advocates. And given the urgent need for political change, this presentation will argue for a Ministry of Animal Protection. So, as we all already know from Ali Abad's presentations from the last years, animals have a right to political representation. This right is based on their moral status and also them being affected by and subjected to state laws. So this principle from political theory, the so-called all-subjected principle, states that all and only those subject to the coercive power of a state ought to have a vote in determining the way in which that coercive power will be exercised. This principle is still widely discussed, but more or less accepted in political theory as the best basis for who should be a member of a political community, and thus it grounds a right to political representation. Now, the next question is whether animals can actually be represented politically. And the standard way to ensure political representation in a representative democracy is through active participation. Representation in this standard mode is thought of as a principal-agent relationship, where the constituent, as a principal, authorizes, for example through an election, the representative, as an agent, to then produce a policy output. This policy output then gets re-evaluated by the principal. If it is deemed negative, the representative won't be re-elected, and if it is deemed positive, well, then this representative will be re-elected. So this standard mode for representation ensures that the representatives actually act in the interests of the constituents. Now the question arises, if animals cannot actually cast votes, if they can't authorize representatives through elections, can they even be represented? Because as we see, animals can neither actually authorize through an election, nor can they even evaluate the policy output by themselves. So it might seem that animals can't be represented. But as the concept of proxy representation tells us, this does not necessarily have to be true. because there simply can be proxy representatives who derive the interests of the constituents of the animals and produce a policy output in their favor. This concept of proxy representation has been discussed widely, and the main point in discussing this principle has always been an epistemic one. So how can the representatives actually know what their constituents want? How can a proxy representative know what an animal wants? And that is a fair question, and it certainly needs to be discussed. But at this point, I will just presuppose that we can more or less accept what most moral philosophers tell us, that animals have an interest in a continued life and also in having at least pleasurable experiences in the widest sense. So generally speaking, we could say a proxy representative can simply take those interests and try to produce a policy output. And now even those institutions for the proxy representation of animals need to be authorized, need to be created by humans, and their output then needs to be re-evaluated by those humans, at least in the anthropocentric political system that we currently live in. And as the political theorist Svenja Alhaus remarks, the proposal to represent animals politically must be accompanied by considerations as to how representative relationships can be assessed normatively and regulated in praxis. Who should have the right to appoint representatives for animals? How can it be ensured that their interests are interpreted convincingly? So, if we want to create such an institution, we obviously want one that gives an incentive to the individuals in this institution to take the interests of animals seriously and produce policies according to those interests. And as I said, the problem is urgent, so it should be able to be implemented in the near future. One such potential institution is to give a veto right to animal organizations. So this intervenor status for animal advocacy organizations in legal or political processes could then be used to simply veto every proposed law that would actively harm animals if it were to pass. But there are problems with this idea. First of all, it's a really unconventional model, which just simply makes it less likely, at least in the near future. Secondly, there would most likely be a lack of public acceptance for non-elected vetoes. So someone simply coming and saying, this bill that your elected officials wanted to pass, it will not pass, just because we say so, even though nobody directly legitimized us to do so. And there is a lack of accountability, so no one can actually look at what those organizations do, what they veto and what they don't, and hold them accountable for it. But those are minor problems. The biggest problem and the key flaws of this proposal is that veto players can only prevent change, not initiate it. So they could not actually change the status quo. So looking again at what we want, the problem with this idea is that it doesn't produce policy, it only prevents it, and it could most likely not be implemented in the near future, even though it actually gives politicians an incentive to take the interests of animals seriously. Because if they were to propose a law that acts contrary to those interests, it simply would be vetoed and it wouldn't pass. Another proposal, and actually one that has been instated in Germany already, is the idea to have animal protection commissioners. Animal protection commissioners can be understood as ombudsperson with reduced competencies, and as Pablo Magaña says, an ombudsman is usually appointed by governments or legislatures and has the power to investigate and review legislative and administrative procedures. It does not have formal powers to enforce compliance with its decisions and recommendations. And Kimberly K. Smith also says that legislators could adopt the practice of routinely consulting an animal representative on policies that might affect animal welfare. we don't have accountability with those animal protection commissioners. They're not accountable to the public. But that is relatively unproblematic since they don't produce binding decisions. But of course, this institution, as Alastair Cochrane says, does not guarantee their right to democratic representation within the legislature. So yes, while, as Kimberly K. Smith says, legislatures could adopt the practice of routinely consulting an animal representative, they have no incentive to do so. And that is the main problem. It doesn't directly produce policy, and it doesn't give any incentive for politicians to actually act in the interests of animals, but it could be implemented in the near future in other countries too. The last proposed alternative idea to the one that I will present, which I want to discuss a bit more extensively, is giving animal representative seats in parliaments. So there would be an election to then vote members as animal representatives in parliaments, who then, of course, do the normal stuff that parliamentarians do and produce policies. So, as Alastair Cochrane says, we could reserve a portion of seats in the legislature for dedicated animal representatives, that is, legislators whose sole task it is to ensure that animal interests are heard, considered, and weighted appropriately in the framing and formulation of public policies. This institution would give attention and visibility for animal-related issues. Of course, this way there would be many people with expertise on animals and policy effects on animals within legislatures. And this institution actually has the power to shape legislation. Also, of course, it would empower people who are well-suited representatives for animals. But how exactly do we incentivize those politicians to act in the interests of animals to get re-elected? Because of course we could say we already have politicians in parliaments and they could also represent animals. Problem is, most of them don't. The first idea discussed by Dan Hooley is to restrict the electorate. So not everyone gets to vote on those members of parliament. Only those people who have experience considering animal rights and animal interests and who would most likely vote in good faith should be able to vote for those animal representatives. And we could achieve that, for example, by only including those who have demonstrated a concern for animals, one idea. But of course that has the problem that this is a really ambiguous boundary. And this would lead to a constant politicization of the electorate. So who gets to vote in which election concerning the interests of animals? Some people say, hey, I have demonstrated a concern for animals. Others would doubt the same. And this constant politicization of the electorate, this politicization of the process could harm its perceived legitimacy. Alternatively, we could only choose those people to be part of the electorate who are experts in relevant fields. But, of course, that does not guarantee that they will vote in the interests of animals. So some people might have a lot of knowledge concerning animals because they are butchers. Of course, that wouldn't mean that they would actually vote in the interests of animals. Dan Hooley also says that we could restrict the electorate only to people who haven't committed crimes against animals. Here, of course, what is a crime against animals? Most people here would most probably say that eating animals is a moral crime against animals. But even if we just say, okay, legal crimes, that restricts the electorate a bit, but doesn't actually ensure those first two ideas of only having those with expertise and who are concerned about animals and who would vote in good faith. Now, a fourth idea, we could say that we restrict the electorate to only those who are members of animal rights organizations. This idea seems intuitively relatively plausible, but it is under-inclusive, because not everyone is a formal member of an animal rights organization who cares about animals. Personally, I am actually not. It also reinforces social inequality because being member of an organization most of the time costs money or another important resource, time. So in this way, poorer people would most probably be more excluded from the electorate. And of course, there would be harsh changes in membership after the implementation of such restriction on the electorate. So everybody, let's say, who has an interest in animal exploitation would try to get as many members as to become a member of such an organization. Then Hooley thus proposes two things: a voter selection by lottery, and then the people need to take competency classes, or alternatively, he says both ideas are fine, only those who pass a competency exam about the interests of animals should be allowed to vote. Of course, there's a problem with the definition of competency. It's basically the same argument for when humans should be able to vote. A lot of people intuitively have this idea about only those should be allowed in human elections who actually know how politics work. But the definition of competency is the really problematic part that also threatens political equality. And of course, there's the question on whether limiting the electorate in this way would avoid violating the human right to vote. So we say that being allowed to vote is a human right. And then Hooley answers this question saying that there actually isn't a problem because humans still can vote in human elections. They don't need to be able to vote in the animal elections. But of course, all the policies produced by those animal representatives in parliament would also affect humans. And for example, if those animal representatives decided to ban companion animals altogether, an abolitionist position that is not shared by most animal rights advocates, this decision would of course also affect humans. So they would be affected by the decisions of the animal representatives on which they didn't get to vote. So we could instead restrict the representatives only, for example, as Dan Hooley discusses, to members of separate animal-focused political parties. This way, those animal parties would be able to be held accountable because they would be judged on their animal rights platforms, not on their general platforms. This would also create a public discourse about their opinions and stances concerning animal rights, and they would need to publicly defend their positions. And we could use the so-called civilizing force of hypocrisy, basically saying that acting contrary to the stated goals of animal representation becomes more unlikely if you are elected as an animal representative and not just as a normal human representative. But there's also an argument against restriction altogether. So we could say that they threaten political equality. And an answer to that is that people could choose to vote only or run for office only in animal elections or human elections. But of course, this would mean that all those people who vote in the interest of animals in the animal elections wouldn't be able to vote for their own interests in the human election. On the other hand, if we don't restrict it this way, some people get to have two votes, others only one. We could also say that restricting the electorate reduces public engagement with animal interests, and that electing animal representatives could transform public thinking about the roles of animals in society. So it would be good to extend the right to vote on animal elections to as much people as possible. But there are also other questions. The legislative scope. Intuitively, we of course would say that the animal representatives only have the authority to vote on animal-related issues. The problem with this is that other parties wouldn't have any incentive to actually work with those animal parties because they aren't valuable coalition partners. you form a coalition to gain a majority. But if those parties on most issues that don't affect animals don't get to vote at all, well, then they're basically meaningless. So why should you use them to form a coalition? On the other hand, allowing animal representatives to vote on all issues creates a problem that, while it makes them valuable coalition partners, it would be most probably seen as illegitimate, because most people would be uncertain about the non-animal related stances of the animal parties prior to elections. And when something happens, for example, something unforeseen, let's say a new war, and suddenly your animal party has a stance concerning this issue that you don't have, you would say that their votes in parliament are illegitimate. And I think that would make sense. And this is why Dan Hooley proposes that animal representatives in parliament should have the authority to vote on all issues affecting animals, but also including general taxation and spending. And beforehand, the animal parties should communicate their stances. This would make them really valuable coalition partners, because they could be used to gather majorities, even on other issues that don't directly affect animals. The next discussed topic then is the number of seats. So we could on one hand say that based on the principle of one being, one vote, not necessarily one person, it should be proportional to the number of animals within a state. But then again, in Germany, we would have over 80% of the seats in the legislature be reserved for animal representatives, just including the farmed animal and companion animals. I mean, that must not necessarily be a problem, but of course, it could be seen as hindering, at least as a short-term solution. And on the other hand, Dan Hooley argues, and he calls that his pragmatism, that based on the lesser extent to which laws affect animals, because not every law affects animals, animal representatives should be 10 to 15% of the legislature. But of course, that's a totally arbitrary number. It's not based on anything. And even though a lesser number is more realistic, most probably, if you have a totally arbitrary number, that makes it really hard to argue for. I mean, it's just like a gut feeling saying, yeah, 10 to 15% will be fine. It's not too much, not too little. So animals should have, animal representatives should have 10 to 15% of the legislature seats. But if they are only 10 to 15%, how can they actually shape policy, especially concerning animals? Well, they could be given counter-majoritarian powers. They should be able to delay legislation to allow for further debate, create more public awareness, and obviously make it sure that everybody considers the impact of proposed bills on animals' interest. Also, they could be able to mandate judicial review even before the law goes into effect, and they could be able to call for consultation if experts, so people hear what experts have to say on how this bill would most probably affect animals. But that does not need to be discussed, if you ask me, because of course there's an alternative model. So here we have the flowchart for consent bills in Germany. And we see that there is not only the Bundestag, the normal legislature, but we also in Germany have a Bundesrat, which is for the Bundesländer, so the smaller, I don't really find a word for it, sorry. But up until now, the focus has been on giving animal representatives like 10 to 15% of the seats in the already existing parliament. But alternatively, we could just say, especially in systems that don't have a second legislature, that we should have an animal parliament. And this way, we wouldn't actually have to need to discuss the number of seats or counter-majoritarian powers, because every bill concerning animals would have to pass this legislature, which would be entirely staffed with animal representatives. Now, how does this idea in general, no matter whether we restrict the model or not, whether it's 10 to 15% in an existing legislature or in a second legislature. How good is this model as a short-term solution? Obviously not that good. As Dan Hooley remarks, this type of electoral system will only be implemented if there's a significant percentage of a state's human population that supports it and would like to make it work. If it is to get off the ground, enough humans will have to come to believe that other animals deserve some form of legislative representation. So this institution, really good idea, but it could not be implemented in the near future. And considering current political realities, what other institutions are possible? And maybe could effective animal representation be achieved through lobbying, bypassing the need for majority support? Could it work to simply convince some politicians to create an institution irrespective of what the human public wants? I don't think so, because institutions are created and abolished by majority will. That's the basic idea of democracy. And institutions can always be abolished by the same majority that was used for its creation. So an institution that creates policy that runs contrary to the interests of the human electorate will be abolished if it can be abolished. And this means that only institutions which are created via a supermajority cannot be abolished that easily. But it is pretty unrealistic that a supermajority in any existing political system will create an impactful institution for the animal representation. So human support is a necessary condition for the stability of an institution for the representation of animals, even if it were to be created without it already having public support, for example, through lobbying. We cannot simply, through the backdoor, lobby our way into effective animal representation. In the German case, it would mean, for example, with a supermajority, that every party except the far-right AfD would be needed for the creation of such an institution, even the Conservative Party. And as we will see, that would be pretty hard. Because we have the case with the abolition of animal protection commissioners in Germany. The Federal Animal Protection Commissioner, Ariane Kari's contract was actually not removed, and she was replaced by a conservative politician who works as a parliamentary state secretary for the Federal Minister of Food and Agriculture. And from Animal Society, here you see how well her ideas concerning animals are. The deep red, you know what it means, even if you can't read the text. And also we have seen that the government of Berlin actively removed its Animal Protection Commissioner, Katrin Hermann. So this shows that even non-powerful institutions get abolished if they oppose the will of the human majority. To make it clear, those two cases are representatives who didn't have the power to actively create policy and whose job titles were about animal protection and animal welfare, and not about animal rights. And even they got abolished by the Conservative Party. Now, the Ministry of Animal Protection works in a different way because it is a majoritarian institution. The electorate, in a plain and simple normal human election, just as they are now, vote for a party that says that they will create a Ministry of Animal Protection, and this ministry then produces policies, they get reevaluated in the next election. And of course, this can also mean that this institution will be abolished, which is a problem. But it also has its merits. So a Ministry of Animal Protection would be part of the executive branch. This is where most laws are initiated. Ministries always have a fairly high budget. Of course, such a ministry would get public attention, so it can be used to initiate a discourse about animal interests. Something similar has been implemented at the European level with the European Commissioner on Health and Animal Protection. We have the popularity of animal protection with more than 69% of the people in each European state wanting more animal welfare for farmed animals. And we have the public support in Germany with 64% of the people in Germany supporting the creation of the Ministry of Animal Protection. Also, it would avoid conflicts of interests, as animal protection would be separated from the ministry, which actually has an interest in the continuation of animal exploitation, And again, the civilizing force of hypocrisy would most probably socialize those ministers into caring more about animal protection. The problem is, taking the interests of animals seriously. Would this institution actually do that? This is a comparable situation to the problems already seen in animal law. So, for example, as Will Kimlicka states, working within the property framework is politically feasible but ineffective, and struggling for real legal personhood would generate real change, but is politically unfeasible. And as Gary Francione states, the only way to eradicate the property status of animals is to convince a significant portion of society. Until a larger segment of society accepts, for example, that our enjoyment of the taste of meat does not justify killing animals for food, legal change for animals will necessarily be limited. That's a sad reality. Like stating that the own opinion is a reality is a bit problematic, but I come to this conclusion, and to conclude, in an anthropocentric democracy, the only way to create an institution for the representation of animals is through a human majority, however unjust that may be. So until we can convince a significant portion of society that animals have moral rights and a political right to democratic representation, a Ministry of Animal Protection seems to be the most promising institution which could actually create policy and which could be implemented in the near future as a next step for animal representation. So I want to thank you for listening. These are my sources, and this is my contact information.
Thank you, Melvin, for your talk. I'm sure there are some questions. We have time for questions, so any questions online?
Test? Okay. Yeah, there's one question that just came in. The person says, interesting presentation, so thank you for that. It seems to be predicated on a proportional representative electoral model common in Europe. I wonder how this might work in a first-past-the-post system where a minority of voters can elect a majority government.
Okay, so that's pretty interesting. It is actually, most political theorists said that those proportional systems are easier for animal representative parties to actually exist and get into the national legislature. I mean, in first-past-the-post systems, where a minority can actually create a majority within the legislature, there are always regional majorities needed for that. And to get a regional majority for effective animal representation, for example, I think would be even harder. I think most probably parties for the representation of animals have it harder to exist there, but considering how this model would actually work, or how the different institutions proposed here would work in those systems, I did not consider that this much. I'm sorry, so I don't have a definitive answer on what exactly those institutions would mean, but I don't think that this much would change.
Okay, thank you. So at the moment, there's no more questions from the online audience. For everyone online, if you do have a question, feel free to write it down.
We have actually 5 more minutes for questions, if somebody else has a question. If there are no questions, then we will finish a bit earlier and have another round of applause. Thank you very much for your talk.